Welcome to part 2 of your lesson on Quebec immigration. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on one specific economic program. Why are we doing this? Well, there's a lot of different programs for Quebec, as you may have seen. And by understanding the Quebec Skilled Worker Program thoroughly, it will help us to understand the other programs. And what are all of these Quebec immigration programs? Well, there's a lot. Do we need to go through all of them? Yeah, sort of. But we are doing this, of course, in the context of your exam. So by working through this one, the Quebec Skilled Worker Program, we're going to give ourselves a good foundation to work with when we jump into the other Quebec programs. So what makes the QSW complex? It's the fact that there's also a points system with this. So I could see you frowning probably already because I know points are difficult, but we'll get through this step by step together, okay? So first of all, we have those educational requirements. We have work experience requirements as well. And those work experience requirements are pretty low, really, in terms of the minimum required. So that's something that is quite interesting. You could see the fourth little check mark there. We talk about ARIMA. And yes, the person makes a profile in ARIMA, just like in Express Entry. So that's an interesting correlation there. And then we have that procedure that we talked about before, which is if the person is selected in ARIMA, great. He or she gets a CSQ and then goes on to apply for PR with the IRCC. So here are the points for Quebec. And when you look at this, it probably seems familiar because the federal skilled worker points follow something that is somewhat similar in terms of course, what the person is being assessed on. So there's always the classic, I guess we could call it, of language, experience, education. Age is often in there for points as well. And some sort of Canadian connection is usually in there, in every program really, every program with points, I should say. So we can see that the Quebec Skilled Worker Points program is similar to this. Now we've got that little cutoff at the end here of 43 points if the person is single versus 52 if the person is married or with a common law partner. And then that final cutoff at the end, which is the 50 versus 59. So that's an interesting contrast to see, even though we have some experience with this already by working through so many Express Entry points questions. So let's begin with education and the field of training. So for educational points, we've seen this one quite a few times where we've seen something similar in Express Entry, federal skilled points, self-employed points. And here in Quebec, well, we see the same thing. Now there's a slight difference in the process for these education points, where previously in other programs, we saw that unless there's an ECA that assesses the credential and gives it an equivalent to a Canadian credential, well, it doesn't exist, right? So if a person has a PhD, but the ECA comes back and says it's a bachelor's degree, it's a bachelor's degree for us, right? Quebec has a similar process to this. The only difference is the name is something different, and it is a different organization that does it. So you can see the name on the bottom. It's a request for une évaluation comparative des études effectuées hors du Québec. And it's pretty standard, really, for educational points. So I don't think we need to worry about that too much. Where it gets interesting is with training points. So this makes perfect sense, actually. I'm surprised Express Entry doesn't do this yet. Maybe in the future they will, where certain fields of training gain a person more points. Now, this theoretically changes all the time. For Quebec, this is something that is a little bit different. There's not really a correlation between knock, for example, and this amount of points. So it depends, it changes, theoretically it should change all the time really, depending on Quebec's needs in terms of people to work in certain areas. Currently it's this really, so you have engineers, you have people who work in health who get the most points, and you have mechanics as well. So specialized people, and then you have people who in the NOC would be actually a similar level, right? Like a psychologist or a scientist. But in points here for training, it's a little bit less. So with this isn't something to really memorize or try or anything like that. But just know that there are different points given for different training areas. Now let's take a look at experience and age. Okay, so experience has a cutoff, remember? That cutoff was 6 months of experience for the Quebec Skilled Worker Program. And we could see when we look at this in terms of points, well, we've got 4 points for just under 2 years, so between 6 months and 2 years. As the experience grows, well, you get more points, maxing out at 48 months. So 48 months means 4 years. If a person has 10 years experience, well, they get the same amount of points as 48. Then age, we've seen this quite a few times in different programs where basically the younger a person is, the more points that they get. All right, for language, this is where it gets a little bit tricky with Quebec, or not tricky, but it's different for Quebec. So let's jump into this one. So remember that Quebec accepts a lot of different exams, and you might see the exam scores referred to as B2, or maybe 8 or 7 on the échelle québécoise. So we'll often see B2 actually because that is often the minimum for certain programs, or I shouldn't even say minimum, for points really, that's what it is. And we could see that over here with the skilled worker program, that if a person has a B1, well, they don't get any points for it, even though there's not necessarily a cutoff score for language. And we can see with Quebec, it's really interesting because, and I think it's a great idea that it's done in a way that people get a lot of points for demonstrating high listening and speaking skills. And reading and writing skills are only worth 1 point, really, if you get above an EQ 7. And that means you could be perfect at reading and writing and still only gain 1 point in here, in French, of course. Now, remember that the échelle québécoise, the CEFR, in the way that we're looking at it, it refers to the French exams for Quebec. Now, for English exams, it's just the IELTS that's used, and that one we can refer to the CLB. So when we think of the EQ, well, if they say B2 or they say something like that, well, we know that a B2 is an EQ 7 to 8. So we can correlate that one pretty easily in there. DELF and DALF, like I said in the lesson, I mean, you'll probably never see this in real life. Personally, I haven't seen this ever in real life. Somebody with a DELF or DALF. My colleagues say the same thing, but theoretically, can it be on the exam? Maybe. I think that you're not very likely to face this. That's why we're kind of doing a concise version to these lessons. But again, we need to know that there are scores for these exams that count towards points in the QSW. Just a reminder at the bottom here that if you ever see these terms in French, compréhension écrite, compréhension orale, just means reading and listening, right? So we talked about that in the lesson. Expression orale just means speaking, and expression écrite just means writing. Okay, and what we sometimes call bonus points for people who have Canadian connections, that's what we are working on next. Okay, so we've got something that's common in a lot of programs, and that's basically if a person stayed in Canada before or has some type of work experience in Canada, some type of connection to Canada. Well, this is a little bit different, right? Because now it's related to Quebec. So you get points for having Quebec experience, and you get points for having relatives here in Quebec. And similar to express entry, well, we get points for the spouse's abilities. Okay, so you can probably see this is very similar to express entry, where you have the education points. In total, the maximum here is 17 points. So if the person maxes out at everything, it's similar to express entry where the spouse might be the better applicant, right? So we've got those educational points over here, the age. The language points here are only in French, so that's different from other programs. And again, only for speaking and listening. So you can see over here, it says C1, B2. Well, remember that correlates with the EQ. And the area of training for the spouse, which changes all the time, which I don't really think you should spend time focusing on that. And an offer of employment. All right, so they break down quite a bit of the Quebec regions over here and the amount of points that a person gets per region. Now the maximum for this is 14, and that's for people who are in that kind of second range over there of Montérégie and places like that. And you've got, well, quite a few points really. I mean, 13, 12, 10, 10 for the Gaspésie, and the Gaspésie is pretty far away as well. So when you think of people who immigrate to these places, it can be, of course, because of a job offer. It can be because they're interested in these places as well. And similar to other programs, Montreal is a pretty big city, and you don't get as many points if your job offer is from here. So similar to express entry, we have a cutoff now of people who are married or with a common law partner, and the cutoff points for that are lower than someone with, a spouse or common law partner. So we could see 43 points that a person needs to have before assessing the next portions if they're single, and 52 if they have a spouse. So the next section is actually one of my favorite things about the whole Quebec skilled worker program is that people get points for having kids. So there's a maximum here of 8, and yeah, I just think it's so friendly of Quebec to understand that people have kids and it's a lot of work and a lot of experience and education as well. So they reward future immigrants for this. And I've heard this actually in traveling and going to conferences and things like that, where people will come up to you and they'll say, hey, I have this experience and I have kids and I know Quebec gives points for having kids. So they'll ask you about Quebec immigration. So it's pretty cool. I think it's a little bit famous in some places. I'm not MIFI accredited, so I would always kind of refer them to Lisette with our company here. But it is something very cool, very interesting to see in Quebec immigration. And the last one gives 1 point, and it's a mandatory point that a person needs, and they sign the financial self-sufficiency agreement. So this agreement is here. It's what we discussed during the lesson, and you might think of it as similar to proof of funds, where basically they need to prove a certain amount of money that they have for taking care of, well, of themselves and their families when they first arrive in Quebec. All right, so we completed the Quebec Skilled Worker Points section here, and now you're going to move on to sample question 2. Now, you know that points questions can be difficult, but they are good for learning, and this one's going to be similar. You probably don't like points questions, but they do teach you a lot. So we are going to work on a tough one in order to make sure that if this comes up in the exam, well, it's not an issue for us. All right, all of you future RCICs and maybe even members of the MIFI, congratulations on finishing this quick little lesson. Let's move on to the example question now.